A Holocaust survivor just went on national television and said Australia is going backwards. Not metaphorically, not politically. He meant dangerously backwards. And when a man who survived history's darkest chapter says he's starting to feel that same tension again, that's not an opinion you scroll past. That's a warning. So before you judge this, before you get defensive, before you switch off, ask yourself one thing. If he's right, what does that say about the country you're living in right now? Stick with me, because what you're about to hear explains why this moment has shaken people far beyond politics. And yeah, before we go any further, drop an AU in the comments if you believe Australia should be a place where no one is afraid to exist, because that belief is about to be tested.
Greetings, Australia. It's your mate from True South Politics, and today's one of those stories that doesn't just annoy you, it sits in your gut. This isn't about left versus right. It's not about party loyalty, and it's definitely not about some overseas conflict being rehashed for clicks. This is about a man who escaped genocide, came to Australia for freedom, and is now standing here in 2026 saying he feels that freedom slipping. On Sky News, Holocaust survivor Eddie Bode looked straight down the camera and blamed the Albanese government for the rise in anti-Semitism across this country. No hedging, no soft language, no PR spin. Just 4 words that cut deeper than any political speech ever could. We came here to be free. And mate, if that didn't hit you, you weren't listening. Because those words carry memory, they carry loss, and they carry an expectation that Australia was supposed to be better than this. But what Eddie revealed next explains why he believes we're failing that promise, and why pretending everything's fine is no longer an option.
Let's get one thing crystal clear right now. Eddie Bode isn't a keyboard warrior. He's not chasing clout, and he's not someone who learned about hatred from history books. He lived it. He survived a time when symbols started appearing quietly, when people told themselves it was just graffiti, when chants were dismissed as emotional reactions, right up until silence did the damage. Australia wasn't just another country to him, it was a promise, a place far from Europe's ruins, a place where you didn't have to glance over your shoulder, a place where your identity wasn't a target. That's why his words matter. When Eddie says he's seeing swastikas reappear in suburbs, when he says Jewish Australians are afraid to wear religious symbols in public, when he says synagogues need heightened security in this country, that's not ideology speaking, that's recognition. And here's the part that should unsettle you. He didn't say this started slowly, he said it spiked. Which brings us to the moment everything changed. Before we get there, if your family came to Australia looking for safety or a fresh start, drop a suitcase in the comments, because this story touches more people than most want to admit.
According to Eddie, there was a clear turning point, October 7th. After the attacks in Israel and the war that followed in Gaza, something changed in Australia's social fabric. And it happened fast. Not debates, not discussions, tension. Suddenly, protests weren't just loud, they were hostile. Jewish-owned businesses were being targeted. Security around synagogues wasn't precautionary anymore, it was necessary. And let's be very clear here, because nuance matters. Criticising foreign governments, fair. Advocating for Palestinian civilians, completely legitimate. But when protests spill over into anti-Semitic chants, when Jewish Australians who have nothing to do with Middle Eastern politics are harassed, when fear follows people home, that's not activism, that's intimidation. And here's the uncomfortable truth most politicians don't want to say out loud. Some of those protests were hijacked by people who weren't interested in peace at all. They were interested in hate. Eddie watched this unfold and saw something terrifyingly familiar, not the scale, but the pattern. Symbols, language, silence, and he noticed something else that made it worse. No consequences. So let me ask you, did you feel that shift too? Type yes or no in the comments, because whether people admit it or not, a lot of Aussies noticed something was off. And this is where Eddie stops blaming the streets and starts pointing straight at Canberra.
This is where Eddie Board stopped speaking in general terms. No more vibes, no more observations. He named names. On national television, he pointed directly at the Albanese government and said their failure to act decisively allowed anti-Semitism to grow. And that's not a casual accusation. That's a Holocaust survivor saying the people in charge didn't shut things down when it mattered most. According to Eddie, the early days after October 7 were the critical window, the moment when leadership either draws a hard line or silently invites chaos. And in his view, that line was never drawn. He specifically called out the lack of clear direction from the Minister for Police. No firm warnings, no immediate crackdowns, no strong message saying this stops here. And when that doesn't happen, something predictable kicks in, because bad behaviour spreads when it goes unpunished. It's like that bloke at the pub who starts mouthing off. If the bouncer steps in early, problem solved. If no one does anything, suddenly half the bar thinks it's acceptable. Except this isn't a pub, this is the social glue holding an entire country together. And Eddie's argument is simple, brutal and hard to ignore. When authorities hesitate, extremists feel emboldened. When arrests don't happen, boundaries disappear. And when leadership worries more about optics than outcomes, regular people pay the price. So here's a quick gut check for you. If you think law enforcement should have stepped in faster and harder, tap the like button right now. Because what comes next explains why this hesitation didn't just affect one community, it affected all of us.
Australia loves talking about multiculturalism. We celebrate it, we advertise it, we pat ourselves on the back for it. Different cultures, different faiths, different backgrounds, all sharing the same footy teams, the same Barbies, the same roads. But here's the uncomfortable reality Eddie is forcing us to confront. Multiculturalism only works when the rules apply equally to everyone. The moment overseas conflicts are imported wholesale into Australian streets and allowed to play out unchecked, that balance starts to crack. Because Jewish Australians didn't vote in Israeli elections, they didn't plan military operations, they don't control foreign policy, yet suddenly they're being treated like stand-ins for a conflict thousands of kilometres away. And that's not just unfair, it's dangerous. The same goes the other way too. Palestinian Australians shouldn't be held personally responsible for decisions made by governments they don't control. But instead of leadership stepping in and saying, "This ends here," we got cautious language, carefully worded statements, and an obsession with not upsetting anyone. And mate, that approach helps no one, because fear doesn't care about press releases. Ask yourself this. How would you feel if your neighbour was scared to wear a necklace, a hat, or a symbol of who they are? If you've ever thought, this shouldn't be happening here, drop your city or suburb in the comments. Not to argue, just to show how widespread this conversation really is. Because what's happening isn't isolated, and the longer it goes unchecked, the more brittle our social trust becomes. Which brings us to the government's favourite strategy. Here's where things start to look ugly for the Albanese government. There've been statements, plenty of them, condemning hate, calling for unity, reaffirming Australian values, all very polished, all very safe. But statements don't stop vandalism. Statements don't make people feel protected. Statements don't deter extremists. Eddie's criticism cuts straight through the spin. The response was too slow, too cautious, too worried about offending the wrong people. And when you try to please everyone, you end up protecting no one. It's like installing a screen door on a submarine. Looks nice, does absolutely nothing when pressure hits. The real frustration here is that the tools already exist. Hate speech laws, public order powers, clear policing authority. But instead of using them decisively, leadership hesitated, and hesitation sends a message, whether intended or not. It says, push a little further. It says, you might get away with this. So let me ask you directly, if words aren't enough anymore, type action in the comments, because what Eddie is really saying isn't about politics, it's about warning signs.
This is the part that makes people uncomfortable, and it should. Eddie Boot isn't shouting, he isn't panicking, he isn't exaggerating. He's recognizing patterns. And people who've lived through history don't need things to reach crisis level before they speak up. They know what early stages look like. Symbols appearing, language shifting, silence being justified as calm. When Eddie says Australia is going backwards, he's not saying we're anywhere near the past he escaped. He's saying he's seen this beginning before. And beginnings are where outcomes are decided. That's why his words carry moral weight politicians can't manufacture. Because when someone who survived humanity at its worst tells you, don't ignore this, you don't dismiss it as overreaction, you listen. If this part made you uneasy, good. Drop a WI in the comments if you're still watching, because the final sections are where responsibility stops sitting with politicians and lands right where most people don't want it.
Let's strip the spin away and talk plainly. Real leadership doesn't wait for polls. It doesn't workshop language, and it doesn't hide behind balance when one side is being targeted. According to Eddie, leadership starts with clarity. Clear instructions to police that hate crimes will be dealt with swiftly. Clear messaging that intimidation, no matter who it comes from, will not be tolerated. Clear consequences. Not warnings, not statements, not ongoing discussions. Because when rules are enforced early, they don't need to be enforced brutally later. And this isn't about picking sides in a foreign conflict. It's about drawing a bright line here, at home. You can march, you can protest, you can argue policy until you're blue in the face. But the moment that turns into harassment, threats, or fear, it ends. Full stop. That's the leadership Eddie expected. That's the leadership Holocaust survivors were promised when they chose Australia. And here's the uncomfortable part most politicians avoid. Calling out anti-Semitism shouldn't come with 17 caveats. You don't need to add a disclaimer every time you condemn it. You don't need to dilute it by immediately changing the subject. One injustice being addressed does not erase others. If you agree leadership should stop tiptoeing and start leading, type enough in the comments. Because this doesn't end with government failure, it continues with public silence. Here's the part nobody likes hearing. This doesn't just happen because politicians mess up. It happens because ordinary people look away. Because speaking up feels awkward. Because calling it out feels risky. Because staying quiet feels easier. But silence is never neutral. It always sides with whoever is loudest. Eddie didn't just criticise government response, he criticised the atmosphere, the way people shrug and say, that's just the times, the way harassment gets downplayed as heat of the moment, the way fear is dismissed because it doesn't affect everyone equally. That's how social cohesion erodes, not in one dramatic collapse, but through 1,000 small silences. Ask yourself something honestly.
If this was happening to your community, if your identity was suddenly something you had to hide, would you be satisfied with statements? If the answer is no, then this isn't someone else's issue. Drop an I in the comments if you're seeing things now you didn't see a few years ago, because the final question of this video is the one Australia keeps dodging.
Here it is. If a Holocaust survivor no longer feels fully safe in Australia, what does that say about the direction we're heading? This isn't about guilt, it's about responsibility. Australia has always told itself a story, that we learn from history, that we don't repeat mistakes, that we don't wait until it's too late. Eddie believed that story. That's why he came here. And now he's standing in front of a camera saying the promise feels weaker than it used to. Not broken yet, but strained. And that yet is doing a lot of heavy lifting. Because the truth is, countries don't collapse overnight. They drift. They normalize things they once rejected. They excuse things they once condemned. Until one day, everyone swears it happened so fast. It never does. If this made you stop and think, comment thinking below, because what happens next depends on whether people treat this as background noise or a warning. This video isn't here to tell you what to think. It's here to ask what kind of Australia you want to live in. One where survivors feel protected, or one where they feel ignored. One where leadership acts early, or one where it apologises later. One where differences coexist, or one where fear dictates behaviour. Eddie Baude didn't ask for special treatment. He asked for the bare minimum: safety, dignity, and a country that lives up to its word. So here's what you can do right now. If you believe politicians need to do better, hit like. If you don't want these conversations buried, subscribe. If you've got an opinion, put it in the comments, respectfully. And most importantly, share this with someone who still thinks, yeah, but it's not that bad. Because history doesn't repeat itself the same way. It just rhymes. I'll catch you in the next one. And until then, stay informed, stay uncomfortable when you need to be, and for the love of Vegemite, let's be better to each other.